You are carrying a wound you never received. Right now, somewhere deep in the architecture of your nervous system, there is a fear. A very specific, very physical fear. Maybe it's the edge of a high place. Maybe it's the dark. Maybe it's the sound of deep water. And if someone asked you to explain it, to trace it back to the moment it was born, you would come up empty. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're standing on a balcony, 50 stories above a city that looks like a toy set. In your head, that the glass beneath your feet is 3 inches thick and reinforced with steel. You know that thousands of people have stood in this exact spot without a single problem. By every measurable rule of logic and physics, you are perfectly, undeniably safe. And yet, your heart is currently trying to punch its way out of your rib cage. Your palms are soaked. Your knees feel like they've dissolved into water. There is a voice, raw and ancient and absolutely certain, screaming at the back of your skull. Get away from the edge. Here's the part that should stop you cold. You have never fallen from a height in your life. You've never watched someone else fall. You've never had a single incident involving heights ever. You've spent most of your life looking at a phone screen, not the edge of a cliff. So why is your body reacting as if it remembers something your mind has no record of? Most of us assume our fears are ours, that they were made by us, shaped by our own childhoods, our own accidents, our own specific story. We love the idea that we are self-contained, complete, that the I inside us is entirely our own creation. But what if that's wrong? What if the terror you feel at the edge of that balcony doesn't actually belong to you? What if it belongs to someone who died before you were born? Someone who is still screaming a warning through the only channel they have left, your blood. Tonight, we're going to look at the very real, very disturbing possibility that your deepest fears are not yours, that they are inherited, ancient, and written into the language of your cells by people whose names you will never know. We're going to follow the science of inherited trauma and find out what it means for the question at the center of everything. Who are you really? For most of modern psychology's history, the dominant theory of the human mind was elegant in its simplicity. It was called Tabula Rasa, the blank slate. The idea, we are all born as empty notebooks. The world is the pen, your story is written entirely by what happens to you, and nothing else. If you were afraid of dogs, it was because one bit you when you were 4. If you feared fire, it was because you once touched a hot stove. Every phobia had a clean, traceable origin story, an incident, a trauma, a specific moment of learning. It was a comforting idea because it put you in control. It said, your fears are yours. Your mind is yours. Your story begins with you. Then the glitches started appearing. Scientists began studying infants, babies just a few months old, who had spent their entire lives in the soft, safe silence of a nursery. These babies had never been outside. They'd never watched a nature documentary. Their parents hadn't told them a single scary story. And when researchers showed these infants the silhouette of a hawk or the slow, winding curve of a snake, their stress responses exploded. Cortisol, racing heart rate, the full biological alarm system, firing instantly before a single lesson had been learned. These babies had no concept of predator, no concept of danger, no concept of death, and yet their bodies already knew. This was a paradox that cracked the blank slate right down the middle. How do you remember that a snake is dangerous if your eyes have never seen one? How do you carry a fear of something that existed 200, maybe 2,000 years before you were born? The blank slate theory said you couldn't. The data said you already had. It forced a radical conclusion. We are not born as empty notebooks. We are born with a library already built into the basement of our minds, a library assembled over thousands of years, filled with lessons written in the only ink that survives death. And if we're inheriting these survival files from the dead, what else are we carrying without knowing it? To understand how a fear can cross generations, we need to talk about a field of science that honestly sounds like science fiction. It's called epigenetics. You already know that your DNA is your body's blueprint, the reason for your eye color, your height, your bone structure. For a long time, science told us this blueprint was permanent, carved into stone the moment you were conceived, unchangeable, fixed. Epigenetics looked at that assumption and said, you're only half right. Think of your DNA not as a static document, but as a massive recording studio mixing board. The genes are the individual tracks, your eye color, your metabolism, your immune system. But sitting on top of every track are volume knobs, tiny molecular switches called methyl groups. These switches don't change the music, but they control what you actually hear. They can turn a gene all the way up or silence it so completely it's as if it was never there. Now here is the part where it gets disturbing. Scientists discovered that intense experiences, especially extreme stress, trauma, and survival events, don't just affect you. They physically reach into your cells and move those volume knobs. And when you have children, you don't just pass down the musical tracks. You pass down the exact positions of every knob you've ever touched. Your trauma becomes their baseline. Your survival response becomes their instinct. The dead hand on the dial never fully lets go. We didn't just theorize this. We watched it happen. In 2013, researchers at Emory University ran a study that should have made international headlines. They took a group of male mice and exposed them to the scent of cherry blossoms. Sweet, soft, completely harmless. But every time those mice caught a whiff of that scent, the researchers paired it with a mild electric shock. The mice learned fast. Cherry blossoms meant pain. They developed a full, trembling terror of that specific smell. Then those mice had children. The pups were raised in a completely different, completely safe environment. They were never shocked, never exposed to any threat, never taught a single fearful lesson. The first time they smelled a cherry blossom, they panicked. Not because anything had happened to them, but because their father's body had mailed them a warning they never asked to receive. The researchers pushed further and checked the grandchildren. Third-generation mice who had never met their grandfather, never smelled what he smelled, never felt what he felt. They were still afraid of cherry blossoms. The grandfather's pain had been pressed like a seal into his genetic material and passed forward through time across 2 full generations into bodies that belonged to creatures who had never suffered a single day. Think of it like a save file. Your ancestors didn't only pass down your nose shape and the way you laugh, they passed down their hardest-earned data, the lessons paid for in blood, every trauma that nearly killed them, encrypted into the language of your cells as a warning for the future. We aren't just inheriting physical traits. We are inheriting the lessons of the dead. And this is where everything you thought you understood about yourself starts to dissolve. We spend enormous energy treating our phobias as flaws, as embarrassing malfunctions, as proof that something is wrong with us. But if epigenetics is telling the truth, your phobia isn't a malfunction. It is a scar that doesn't belong to you. It is a post-traumatic stress response to a tragedy you didn't attend. Think about the story of a woman with a paralyzing, irrational fear of large bodies of water. She was never dropped into a pool. She's never had a close call at the beach. On paper, there is no reason for this fear to exist. But when she traces her family history, she finds it. Her great-grandmother died in a violent shipwreck 3 generations ago. To the woman's conscious mind, that shipwreck is just history. To her cells, it is a flashing red warning, stamped in permanent ink. Do not enter the water. I didn't survive so you could make the same mistake. You might be terrified of the dark because 5,000 years ago, someone who shares your blood watched their entire world get destroyed by a predator in the dead of night. Maybe that wave of social anxiety you feel walking into a room full of strangers isn't weakness. Maybe it's the echo of an ancestor who was exiled from their tribe and learned that isolation meant death. That fear whispering through you at 3 in the morning? That is not your anxiety. That is your great-great-grandmother screaming a warning from her grave directly through your nervous system. A biological alarm clock that has been ringing for 100 years, patient and tireless, waiting for you to finally hear it. The truth is, we are never truly alone inside our own heads. The dead are always right there, whispering be careful through the rhythm of our own hearts. But the rabbit hole doesn't stop at nightmares. Because if we can inherit the suffering of the dead, logic demands we ask the next question. Can we inherit their gifts too? Have you ever met someone who was simply natural at something they had never practiced? A child who sits down at a piano and understands the geometry of music without a single lesson. A person who picks up a language in weeks that takes others years. Or have you ever felt that specific aching homesickness for a place your family left a century ago? You step off a plane in a country you've never visited, and the smell of the air, the color of the soil, feels inexplicably, impossibly right. Researchers call this genetic memory, and it suggests that what we call personality might not be a solo performance at all. In reality, you are more like a choir, Thousands of voices, all singing at once through a single body. Your love for a particular landscape. Your instinct for a certain kind of work. That specific sense of humor you can't quite explain. These might not be things you invented. They might be legacy code. Ancient programs running quietly in the background of everything you are. We are like old houses that have been renovated 1,000 times. The wallpaper is new. The furniture is modern. But the foundation, the hidden rooms, the weight-bearing walls, were built by people whose names we have long since forgotten. Of course, all of this eventually leads us straight into a wall, a genuinely terrifying one. If my fears are pre-recorded, and my talents are inherited, and my reactions are just saved files from the dead, then who am I? If the architecture of me was mostly decided before my parents even had their first conversation, where does I actually begin? Scientists are still grappling with this. We still don't know how to selectively remove these epigenetic tags without accidentally unraveling the rest of the code. In a very literal, very biological sense, we are entangled with our ancestors. We are the vehicle their memories are using to travel into the future, which raises the question that sits at the edge of everything. Is free will even real? When you make a decision, are you making it? Or are you executing a 50,000-year-old script written by people who died before the invention of the written word? When you choose who to love, who to trust, what to fear, how much of that is you? And how much is the accumulated survival data of 1,000 dead strangers? It's a paradox that can make you feel very, very small. But maybe, just maybe, that's not the only way to read it. What if we stopped treating our phobias as enemies? What if instead we started reading them as what they actually are? Love letters. From the dead? Written in the only language that survives them. Think about what your deepest fear actually represents. Someone in your bloodline suffered something so catastrophic, so shattering, that their body rewrote its own code to send you a message across time. They didn't get to sit you down and tell you. They didn't get to hold your hand and say, I need you to know something. All they had was their DNA, and so they wrote it there, in the most permanent place they knew. Don't go near that edge, the DNA whispers. I fell so you wouldn't have to. Don't trust the dark, it says. I was lost there so you could stay in the light. You are not a single, lonely person drifting through a random life. You are a living archive, a breathing monument to thousands of people who simply refused to stop surviving until they could hand you the chance to exist. Every scar you inherited was someone else's sacrifice. Every fear you carry is proof that somewhere in the long chain of your history, someone loved their future children enough to suffer for them. So the next time your heart starts to race for no reason, take a breath. You are not broken, you are not weak, you are not irrational. You are the letter they always hoped would arrive. You are the answer to a prayer that was said 1,000 years before you were born. One last thing before you go. What is your most unexplained fear? The one that has no story, no incident, no memory attached to it. Drop it in the comments. Because I have a feeling, if we look hard enough, we might be able to help you find the ancestor who wrote it.